President Obama appointed him to the National Science Board in 2012. Vint, as you might well expect, is a recipient of numerous awards and commendations in connection with his work on the internet, including the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom, the U.S. National Medal of Technology, the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering, and other awards from around the world. In December of 1994, People magazine identified Vint as one of that year's 25 most intriguing people. And I think that holds true today as well. It's no exaggeration to say that we have a living legend in our presence today, and for that we are extremely honored. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our most distinguished guest, Mr. Vint Cerf.
Wow, well, of all the introductions I've had, that was the most recent. So thank you very much for letting me interrupt your lunch, which was quite good, by the way. This hotel venue turns out to be pretty impressive. Of course, the staff will have to tell you how well that worked out from their point of view. They assembled this thing on the fly, for example, for our benefit. A couple of things before I launch into my time machine. This People magazine thing. My wife, 4 years later, got 6 pages in People magazine, and I only got 1. And she doesn't have a PR department, so that's a little sore spot in our 57 years of marriage. Well, what I would like to do is to take you back in time to 1976. I was hoping to find the actual slides that I used to brief the FCC at Dick Wiley's request about what was happening in computers and communication. I ransacked my basement and I didn't find them, so I had to reproduce some of the timeline. The thing I wanted to point out, though, is that Wiley was remarkably prophetic in his interest in this technology at the time, because no one knew what the ARPANET was, but Dick did. And he had a suspicion that this might actually turn out to be important from the FCC's point of view. Now, it could have turned out otherwise. It could have been a total dud. But as it happens, it wasn't. And so he was right on target. And my first job when I came to Washington was to work at ARPA. But even before I got into the ARPA office, Dick had me over at the FCC trying to explain what was going on in computers and communication. So, timeline. I'm going to take you all the way back to the early 1960s. Glenn Kleinrock, who was on my dissertation committee and was the leader of the Network Measurement Center for the ARPANET project, started his work on packet switching, looking at mathematical models for how store and forward packet switching nets work. And so he broke the back of a really hard technical problem, wrote a dissertation, which was published as a book, I think, in 1964, and came to UCLA to teach statistics and electrical engineering. The following year, after 61, Paul Barron was at Rand Corporation, and he did an 11-volume study with a title on distributed communications. He was trying to figure out how to build a digitized voice network that would survive a nuclear attack. And so he had the idea that there should be a mesh of these computers. And remember, this is 1962. Computers were gigantic things in air-conditioned rooms. He's thinking small boxes on top of telephone poles, scattered across the country, radiating packets in all directions, hoping that if the mesh had holes in it, eventually, the packets would get to their destination if there was some path that would get there. So he wrote this on distributed communications in '62. It was an unclassified report with the exception of 1 volume. And it came to the attention of others, including Donald Davies, who was at the National Physical Laboratory, who also worked at Bletchley Park, for those of you who are history mavens. He was at NPL, he was working on this packet switching idea too, and he in fact invented the term packet for this technology. He consulted with a linguist and they sorted through various terms and the like. And in 1966 was a significant year also for the FCC because Computer 1, which tried to distinguish between pure communication and pure computation, which did not work out very well because even in 1966 it became apparent that computation and communications were commingling and trying to decide which was which and assigning regulatory stance for that was not working very well. In 1968, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency issued a request for quotations for the building of a packet switch network called the ARPANET. And a guy named Larry Roberts, who'd been brought down from Lincoln Laboratories, came to ARPA to run the program and to be one of the primary architects of this idea. Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts, won the contract to build the ARPANET in 1969, and they delivered their first processor to UCLA in October of, or actually it was Labor Day. It was Labor Day in September of 1969. Subsequently, they delivered 4 more processors, and they built a 4-node network at UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, SRI International, and University of Utah. So this started out as a 4-node network. Then in 1971, a guy named Ray Tomlinson invents networked email. And he's the guy that picked the @ sign to distinguish the user from the host name. And that's what you see today, user and host. It started way back in 71. So I've been using electronic mail personally since 1971. Then in 1972, Bob Kahn was asked to demonstrate the ARPANET at the International Computer Communications Conference, the first one. And they called it First International Computer Communications Conference in anticipation that there would be more. And that was done here in Washington. A lot of people came to see applications of the ARPANET sitting in the Washington Hilton Hotel. They could sit at a terminal, and Bob Metcalf, the guy that invented the Ethernet, wrote the manual to let people figure out how to try out some of these applications. So that was a big success. It was the first time that we had shown the public what packet switching could do. And then in 1973, late 72, Bob Kahn leaves Bolt, Beranek, and Newman and goes to ARPA. And I leave UCLA to join the Stanford faculty. And so in 73 in the spring, Bob came to my offices and he said, "We have a problem." And I remember thinking, "What do you mean we?" And he said, "Well, we've got this ARPANET, but we're now interested in the use of these technologies for command and control. If computers could be applied in command and control, you might manage your resources better than your opponent. And that would give you what's sometimes called a force multiplier." He said, but the implications of trying to use it for command and control means that you had to have in mobile vehicles, ships at sea, and aircraft all part of the communication system. Well, the ARPANET was just built on dedicated circuits connecting the packet switches to each other. And so that doesn't work. You know, the tanks run over the wires and they break and the ships get tangled up and the airplanes don't make it off the tarmac. So he had already started working on a mobile packet radio system, which would be deployed in the San Francisco Bay Area for test purposes, and also a packet satellite system using Intelsat 4A over the Atlantic to connect the western coast of Europe to the eastern coast of the United States. Also in 1974, we had started something called the International Network Working Group in 1972. I was the first chair. And as it was like 30 or 40 people from Europe and Japan and elsewhere, so it was a very international group interested in packet switch communication. It was just an informal organization, but it got formalized as part of Technical Committee 6 and Working Group 6.1 of the International Federation of Information Processing. And so in the 1976 briefing to the FCC, Alex Kern, who was the chair of, actually it should be the Technical Committee 6, not Working Group 6, came along with us, and there's a photographic record of that meeting because the FCC had a photographer take pictures, and you sent us this beautiful bound set of pictures from that briefing. So Alex and I wanted to talk to the FCC about what we imagined could be the future of computing and communication. So this is just to give you an idea. This is the first packet switch delivered to UCLA. It's the size of a refrigerator. And it is built out of very heavy-duty metal. And of course, it's going into a highly hostile environment, a collection of graduate students. And if you don't think that's hostile, you know what I mean. So this is the first packet switch delivered to UCLA, and 4 other identical ones were sent to the other, 3 others, to the other 3 sites. This one is still at UCLA in room 3420 of Bolter Hall, where Len Kleinrock has a memorial collection of equipment. These are the 4 nodes of the original ARPANET. The Sigma 7, which is the one machine I worked on, is in a museum now, probably the Computer History Museum up in the Bay Area. Some people think I should be there along with it, but I'm here. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is that all the computers are different manufacturers. Digital Equipment Corporation's PDP-10, Sigma 7 from Xerox Data Systems, the 360 from IBM, and the 940 from the Berkeley Computer Corporation. So the problem here was not just figuring out how to move packets back and forth, sort of like electronic postcards, but how to get different computers with different operating systems to actually communicate successfully through the system. And that was a non-trivial exercise because the operating systems were different. The coding inside, the character coding is not the same in all the machines. So that was another major breakthrough that the ARPANET delivered. Now, I mentioned that packet radio was introduced in order to deal with mobile communication. So this van was built by SRI International and was going up and down the Bayshore Freeway, radiating packets out of the stacked dipole array antenna you see in the, sort of the top there. And you notice it's not marked at all. So the engineers would take this thing out and go up and down the Bayshore Freeway. One day they pulled off to the side of the road to measure the shot noise coming from the cars to see how much interference that was going to do to our radio system. And some police car noticed this big van parked at the side of the Bayshore, and there's nobody in the cab. So he goes and knocks on the door in the back, the doors open up, and he sees all these really geeky guys with computers and displays and, you know, beards. And he looks at them and he says, "Who are you?" And one guy says, "Oh, we work for the government." And he says, which government? "Well, officer, we were only going 50 kilobits a second." Now, the briefing in 1976 started out by just talking about where we were in the packet switching domain, what was happening with the ARPANET, and by 76 we were well into the design of the internet. We had gone through about 2 iterations of the design, and there were going to be 2 more before we settled around 1978. But we asserted at that meeting that there would be a coalescence of computing and communication. That this seemed to us inescapable, given what we had already learned and experienced and used on a day-to-day basis. We talked about the research work that was going on, the by that time 3-year-old internet design effort. We talked about packet radio and packet satellite. We also talked about commercial implementation of packet switching, which was done in the beginning in 1976. So this was a timely moment again. I mean, I can't tell you how remarkable it is that they picked that time to ask these questions. So X25 and X75 was a CCITT standard. That's now the International Telecommunications T division. 4 companies, Telenet, DataPack, PSS in the UK, and Transpac in France, all agreed to work together. These are government-sponsored. Well, not Telenet was a private sector one, but DataPack, PSS, and Transpac were sponsored by the respective governments. They were all willing to work together to standardize packet communication. That was a very successful technology. It spread very rapidly. It was heavily used in the banking industry, for example, and may still be in use in a few places today. But remember that I mentioned that we were thinking of using computers for command and control. You cannot escape the need for voice communication and image and video communication in addition to data. And so we were persuaded early on that packetized speech and packet video would have to be a portfolio application of the packet switch schemes. Now I have to tell you, the bandwidth of the ARPANET at the time was a blazing 50 kilobits a second. I mean, that was broadband at the time. So there's a little problem here. Those of you who are familiar with it know that digitized speech typically is about 64 kilobits a second, 8,000 samples, 8 bits. Can't cram a whole lot of that in a 50 kilobit circuit. So we started looking at a variety of compression schemes And one of them was called Linear Predictive Code with 10 Parameters, which which models your voice tract as a stack of cylinders that are changing in their diameter as you speak, and they're excited by what's called a formant frequency, which you could think of as pitch. So it would compress the 64 kilobit stream down to 1800 bits a second. And then you'd send that data to the other side, and then the other side would invert the encoding and produce sound. Now, you could imagine that if you go from 64 kilobits a second down to 1800 bits a second, you might lose a certain amount of quality from the sound. Anyone who talked through the system sounded like a drunken Norwegian. Now, you have to realize that I'm at ARPA, and we're doing this stuff, and I now am asked to demonstrate the packet speech system to a bunch of generals at the Pentagon. And I'm trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to do this? And then I remembered that one of the participants in the program was Ingvar Lund, who was at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. And so we had him speak through the Autobahn system, which was the military circuit switch voice system. Then we had him speak through the packet speech system, and it sounded exactly the same. And we didn't tell the generals that everybody would sound that way. Then in 1977, which is a little after this first FCC briefing, we did the first 3-network demonstration of the internet. So these white boxes, those are the packet radios. They were about a cubic foot. They cost about $50,000 each. Think about what you have in your pocket or your purse now. Pretty amazing, to say nothing of the computing power. So those were the packet radios of the day in the van. And you can see we were working on packet speech early on with our little Mickey Mouse telephone. And it actually worked pretty well. So we were doing demonstrations of all forms of communication, data, voice, and eventually video in the packet radio van. It was a sort of a religious experience, really, because we'd take these generals out and we'd drive them up and down the Bayshore Freeway. We'd stop under a bridge. All communication would cease because of radio shadow. And then you'd drive out again and they'd pick up right where it left off. TCP was retransmitting, trying to make sure all the pieces were glued back together. So in 1994, the 25th anniversary of the ARPANET happens, and Newsweek decides that they want to do a spread. And so they asked John Postel and Steve Crocker and me to do a backdrop and then demonstrate the primitive nature of networking at the time that it started. It took us all day to set this up. We had to go get the 5-pound tins of coffee and dump the coffee out, find the zucchinis and the yellow squash and the yellow cable. And we put it all together, and they did this shot. Now, you will notice perhaps that this was a geek joke, because this network went ear to ear and mouth to mouth, but no mouth to ear. It never would have worked. And so that was our little geek joke for the people who would get it. So this is a demonstration of the 3-network system. And the thing that looks like an amoeba swallowing the packet satellite net was the ARPANET, which by this time had been extended to Europe through an internal satellite hop inside the ARPANET. So the packet radio van is radiating packets through the packet radio network in the Bay Area. It goes through a gateway, which today we would call a router, into the ARPANET, all the way to Norway, and then down to London, to University College London, and then out of the ARPANET into the packet satellite network through another gateway, and then out of the packet satellite net back into the ARPANET through a gateway in West Virginia, ETAM, West Virginia, and then through the ARPANET down to USC Information Sciences Institute at Marina Del Rey in Los Angeles. So I'm in DC in my office down at 1400 Wilson Boulevard, and this thing is going on, and it works. Now think about this for a minute. Even though the distance between San Francisco and LA is only 400 miles, the packets went through 2 synchronous satellite hops all the way across the Atlantic and the US. It's about 100,000 miles. And it worked. And I remember leaping around in my office saying, it works, like it couldn't possibly have worked. It's software. And I think all of you know it's a miracle when software works. So this was very persuasive demonstration that the technology could actually work across very different kinds of packet switching systems. Well, the idea caught on, and the other parts of the government decided that they wanted to make use of this technology. And NSF wanted to connect 3,000 universities to their supercomputer centers, 5 of them, across the United States. The Department of Energy had labs all over the place. They wanted to interconnect them, the ESNet. The NASA decided with it had labs all over the U.S. They wanted to connect them as well. So they all decided to use TCP/IP. They all connected all their networks together into a mesh, which is what the system was designed to do. So this grew dramatically in the 1980s and 1990s. Of course, this is what the internet looks like now. And those of you who probably can't read the teeny-weeny print there, I'm cheating a little because this was actually done around 1999. It was generated from looking at the Border Gateway Protocol routing tables to see how many different networks there were. And we changed, the colors are different networks. There are about 50,000 networks in the internet today. Here's the thing that's so amazing. 80% or so of the agreements between those carriers are not on paper. It's a handshake deal. They don't charge each other. They just carry each other's traffic. That's it. I'm sure if anybody had walked into the FCC in 1976 and said, this is what we're going to build, and there won't be any contracts, it's just, everybody will carry everybody else's traffic. The economists at the FCC would have told Dick, this guy's smoking dope. And I confess to you that at the time we were doing this, I didn't think about that because it was all the government. The government paid for everything because it was an experiment. But it drifted out of experimental stage when NSF and NASA and DOE got involved building these backbone networks. Commercialization happens in 1989. The first 3 commercial networks pop up. PSINet, UUNet, and SurfNet. So now we'll pick up the history here. Network Analysis Corporation in 1979 was tasked by ARPA to analyze 3 different cases for carrying voice: pure packet switching, pure circuit switching, and some hybrid model of the two. And when they got done with their analysis, based on the cost of circuit switches and the declining cost of conventional computers, that it was cheaper to use packet switching than any of the other alternatives. And of course, at the time, this was not considered reasonable. The people who had been building circuit switch networks took one look at this report and said, well, obviously they got something wrong. Well, I'm sure most of you know that almost all of the voice communications you do today is done on a packet switch base because it's cheaper and more flexible, especially now that we've got software-defined networking. So in 1983, there's a little story here. 1982, at the end of 82, John Postel, the guy with the big beard in that picture, announced to everyone with my support that everyone had to switch over to the TCP/IP protocols on the ARPANET by January 1st, 1983. And there was a lot of screaming and yelling. Why do we have to do that? The ARPANET protocols work great. I do my email. Who are you to tell us that? But John said, that's the plan. And I said, yep, that's the plan. So we started encouraging people to implement TCP/IP in addition to their other older protocols. So I'm getting a report every week about how many computers on the internet can do TCP/IP. And in June, it flattens out. So at the time, the Defense Communications Agency is running the network. And I called them up and I said, I want you to shut off the ability of the ARPANET to carry anything except TCP/IP, which they could do. So they did for a day, just for a day. Of course, as soon as they turned it off, my phone rings off the hook, you idiot, what are you doing, you dumbass, bureaucrat, mobile. And I said, look, I just wanted you to know I can do that. So the curve goes up for a while, and then in October it flattens out again, and I tell them to turn it off for 2 days. So by 83, some fraction of the computers were ready to go, probably about 60 or 70%. 30% of them didn't quite make it. By that time, I had left to go to work for MCI, but Bob Kahn was left holding the bag in the transition. But it happened, the transition really occurred. Operational internet begins literally 40 years ago. In 84, Cisco Systems gets started out of Stanford University, so they're now making commercial routers. There's no service yet, but you can buy equipment commercially that can help you build a piece of internet. So the universities were buying routers from Cisco and Ethernet from 3Com and building up their campus communications capability. And then, as I say, in 1986, NSFNet, ESNet, and NSINet pop up as government-sponsored backbones, and then these three UUNet, PSINet, and SurfNet started. Now, I know that I want to be careful about time here, and I wanted to allow for some Q&A, but I have to tell you, the SurfNet was originally SURFNet. It was being built by General Atomics in San Diego. I mean, what else would you do? You surf the internet. So they had T-shirts, the whole thing was all worked out. Surf the internet. And then they discovered about 3 weeks before launch that somebody in the Netherlands had built something called SURFNet, which the initials were for some nonprofit organization hooking Dutch universities together. So they can't use SURFNet. So one of the guys at General Atomics says, well, why don't we rename our network the California Educational Research Foundation Network? Sounds the same. Then somebody says, well, maybe we should call Vint. So they call me. Is it okay if we name our network SurfNet? And my first reaction was, yeah, if they screw it up, am I going to be embarrassed? And then I thought, well, wait a minute. People name their kids after other people, and they don't blame the people they named them after. So I said, sure, go ahead. So I flew out in July of 1989, and Susan Estrada, who was the executive director, and I took this plastic bottle of glitter, and we smashed it over a Cisco router, and we launched the SurfNet. So those were the three original commercial networks, and of course it grew rapidly after that. Then, in 91, Tim Berners-Lee and Robert Cale announced the World Wide Web. And almost nobody noticed, to be really honest about it. But two guys, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina, at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, decided, they saw this text-based browser from Tim, and they said, well, what if we made it a graphical user interface? So they developed something called Mosaic. And it was a smash hit. Everybody saw the internet as like it was a magazine, formatted text and imagery, and eventually streaming audio and video. So a guy named Jim Clark, who was the founder of Silicon Graphics, took one look at this and says, that's a big deal. Goes off and he brings Andreessen and Bina and others to the West Coast to start Netscape Communications in 93. In 94 he starts Netscape Communications. And interestingly enough, Amazon gets started in 1994, in case you didn't know that, and also Yahoo. So they come on the cusp of what's often called the dot boom, because as soon as Netscape Communications went public, the stock went through the roof. And the Silicon Valley venture capital people started throwing money at anything that looked like it might have something to do with the internet. Do you remember Pet Rock? So in 96, after this dot boom is going, Vocaltech comes out with a commercial voice over IP package that you can run on your laptop and communicate with anybody in the world through the internet. And Google gets started in 1998. So that's as much of the history that I wanted to draw to your attention. That brings you to 25 years ago, basically. And now this is what happened since that time, over the 25-year period. The bottom part of this chart is the technical stuff. But what's occupying everybody's time and energy? It's policies, it's economics, it's competition, it's bad people on the internet sending bad stuff, it's malware, it's just an endless